NVIDIA's $300 RTX 4060 releases tomorrow, with reviews going up today, but also kind of on Monday with some asterisk restrictions. And its most direct competitor, at least recent one, is the AMD RX 7600, which itself is $300. Actually, it's $270. They changed it before launch. Actually, it's $250 now because in the week since launch, it has dropped precipitously. So $250 7600 is the closest competition. And AMD, of course, making it as hard as possible for us to retain any sort of accuracy while discussing GPU price in a review. Now, this card is following up the 4060 Ti, which was a massive waste of hardware given its positioning. The problems with that one primarily stemmed from the narrow bus width and frame buffer related issues. And we talked about all those in our review. It was one of our most negative reviews in years that I can remember. So the bar's low. The 4060 Ti itself was a $400 card that has now been as low as like $380 with sales recently. So basically, what we're being told by the GPU manufacturers is people not buying stuff makes price go down. Learn more in my Economics 101 class. The 4060 is the cheapest NVIDIA card introduced in some years. So today we're reviewing it and benchmarking it against the 4060 Ti, the 7600, the A750, and we'll also have several older GPUs. Those include the RTX 3060, the 2060, and the 1060 in our charts. Let's get started with this one. Before that, this video is brought to you by Squarespace. We use Squarespace for our own GN store and juggle complex multi-piece orders all the time with it. Squarespace makes it fast for us to roll out new products with detailed pages full of galleries, videos, and descriptors. It's also useful for your own resume sites, for photographer or project portfolios, or for starting your new small business idea. There's never been a better time to try and start your new business than right now. And we can vouch that Squarespace makes it easy. Visit squarespace.com/gamersnexus to get 10% off your first purchase with Squarespace. So the very basics, the RTX 4060, it's a partner-only launch. There are no Founders Edition cards. That means we're working with a partner model, and the one that NVIDIA chose to send out to reviewers was the ASUS Dual model. It has an overclocking percent increase option of up to 20%. We tested it stock as always, but we have power numbers for it with the OC applied. Now, the biggest limitation here is that memory bus, which is the same for all cards. It doesn't matter which partner it is, it's a GPU thing. So the memory bus is 128 bits wide. It's the same as the 4060 Ti's memory bus. That is down from a 192-bit bus on the 3060 series cards. However, the cache has increased significantly with the 40 series, and that's been NVIDIA's #1 defense since they announced these things like a couple months ago. And we've talked about that, and then we proved in the 4060 Ti review that it simply is not as beneficial as NVIDIA wishes it could be, because increasing the cache would be far cheaper than doubling or even just increasing by 33% the VRAM on the cards that they're shipping. So that limitation, well, and also the bus width challenge. So it's the limitations here where NVIDIA is trying to shrink the die size, which means axing the bus width and either reallocating that die area to something else or just cutting it entirely to drive costs down, while also reducing the physical memory modules and the cost of memory on the GPU. That's what's putting NVIDIA in this position where they're trying to drive up margins, they're trying to drive down cost to do that, and you end up with cards that are just not scaling that well as you get past 1080p. So we're stuck in this weird time vortex of 2016 looking at 1080p for a best case scenario for modern sort of quote unquote low end GPUs. That was like not serious, by the way. Before someone's like, low end reviewers, $400, not low end. Now the best thing that the 4060 has going for it in terms of that memory spec is the reduction of its power overall, not like consumed power, but performance. And that's because the limitations of the memory may become less binding if instead we are hitting limitations of, say, FP32 units instead, rather than with the 4060 Ti, where you're definitely becoming bandwidth bound. The RTX 3060, confusingly, was a 12 gigabyte card back when it launched. So the 8 gigabytes here on the 4060 is a reduction in frame buffer size. The 3060 also had the 192-bit bus width, but a smaller cache. PCIe further is limited, so it's actually on a by 8 interface. And the most positive thing is the MSRP. The 3060 launched for $330. With the 4060 launching at $300, that's at least down. And that would be great. The performance will also be higher, so that's a move in the right direction. Unfortunately though, the scale has moved so far for the GPU stack to where the 4060's comparative performance, meaning its relative scaling against its neighbors and predecessors as compared to prior years' 60 series cards, is perhaps more similar to what we would expect of a 4050 if using prior GPU performance scaling and naming schemes. As long as the value is there, whatever. At some point, it is in fact just a name. But as we've discussed before, the real problem is, what does the name convey? And in a scenario where the community has a set expectation for what a 60 series class card is and what it does and what it's worth, it's not really reasonable to expect you can just, oops, move all the names to the right a little bit, increase the price, and not have people minimally confused and maximally feel ripped off, which they do, at least for the last several launches now. Now, before we really get into it, we also have to be wary of NVIDIA's approach to marketing this product. So NVIDIA allowed for reviewers to post early pre-embargo, basically impressions, so one benchmark of the 4060. That's abnormal. This is typically everything has to be held until the embargo lifts, so everyone publishes the review at the same time. There have been a few exceptions to this over the years, but this particular one is very restrictive. And the past exceptions that, top of my head, I can remember weren't quite as constrained as this one. So here's how it worked. NVIDIA basically reached out to a handful of media outlets. We were included in that. And they asked, do you want to run early tests? Here are the parameters. We obviously declined, or you would have seen a video from us. And my understanding is that Steve from Hardware Unboxed also declined for similar reasons. So the reasons we had, at least at GN, were that it's only Cyberpunk, it's only with this particular game settings, and we didn't get any further into details than that because I instantly was like, no? And to be fair, our rep expected that answer. And there's not even sort of the cover fire of, this isn't a new game, it's not a new feature, it's just very explicitly chosen, kind of loses the guise of being for any reason other than obviously marketing. You know, I don't have the biggest problem with other creators taking that. It all comes into the approach. So if it's disclosed, if they explained how it worked, and it's very clear, then whatever, fine. The more concerning part is just what is this telegraph from NVIDIA, which is, we are concerned about the reception of this product. That's what it telegraphs. Anyway, we said no, and this is our full review. So we're gonna keep the charts really objective, run through them, and we'll talk about it at the end. We'll start with the thermals and the fan curve because it's actually really interesting for this card. These are specific more to the video card from ASUS than from the GPU on NVIDIA's side. For this test, we ran a ray-traced workload until steady state and allowed it to hold for 30 minutes. This was in a fixed ambient temperature of 21 degrees Celsius. The GPU temperature spiked hard and then fell down to about 58 degrees Celsius over time. The hotspot temperature ramped immediately to 80 degrees, fell to 60, and then ramped back to 70. This is extremely abnormal behavior, and it's indicative of a terrible fan curve design or very bad contact with an overcompensating fan. We can determine which of those two it is by plotting the fan curve against the right axis. We can see that it was too late to start. It kicked in just after the load got bad, and then it overcompensated immediately as a result, and then it gradually backed off. So the contact is fine. It was just a late start or bad hysteresis because the workload remained constant during this time. The fan then started ramping again in the middle before falling off, and that's not ambient fluctuation. ASUS's hysteresis here is improperly timed and is designed in such a way that the user will be made hyper-aware of any ramps and deramps because it responds that much. ASUS has done poorly in building its vBIOS, and this is something that can be corrected with basically a BIOS update for your video card. Whether or not they shipped the retail ones like this, We don't know, but at least the review sample came this way. Now on to the games. Cyberpunk 2077 is one of the more intensive games in our test suite. So at 1080p, the RTX 4060 ran at 86 FPS average, which allows the RX 7600 a lead of about 4%. That's not a great start for the 4060. The 4060 Ti is 23% of the 4060 here, demonstrating why NVIDIA positioned this card the way they did. There had to be a reason to spend $100 more. Any less than 20%, it's even worse than it already is for the 4060 Ti. In the previous generation, the 3060 Ti was about 26% ahead of the 3060, so at least this much tracks. The A770 and A750 are both dangerously close to the RTX 4060, with the A750 having been as low as $200 recently. It still has hit and miss drivers, but it's improved so drastically that it's become a relevant competitor. 1440p is somewhat playable on this class of card, especially if you drop the settings a bit. The RTX 4060 held 1440p at 52 FPS average, with 1% and 0.1% lows timed proportionally to the cards flanking it. The 7600's 56 FPS average isn't a noticeable improvement, but it's still better. The A750 also outperformed the RTX 4060, with the 6600 XT getting dangerously close. The 3060 Ti leaps way ahead at 62 FPS average, and it's just behind the 4060 Ti. As we talked about in the 4060 Ti review, these lower-end 40 series cards sometimes struggle as resolution increases, but we've noticed, and you'll see this throughout the review, that the 4060 at least seems to be in a better position relatively than the 4060 Ti was. Let's test the continuance of that scaling behavior. In the same game at 4K, even though you wouldn't necessarily expect playability here, we can study the performance to understand the card's ranking. The 4060 falls significantly behind, regressing as compared to the RTX 3060. NVIDIA is struggling to compete with itself here as resolution boosts in this game, with even the RTX 2060 getting embarrassingly close to the 4060. This is disappointing to see. Even if the card is more likely used for 1080 or 1440p, it's just not what you want from something that's many years newer than a 2060. Once again, though, it's clear why NVIDIA wants everyone using DLSS. It makes the new stuff look a lot better than it actually is. In Final Fantasy XIV at 1080p, the RTX 4060 at 189 FPS average leads the RX 7600 by 2.5%. It's not a lot, but for NVIDIA's sake, it's at least swung back in the direction that benefits it. The 0.1% lows are also significantly bolstered on the 4060 as compared to the RX 7600 and the RX 6600 XT. We'll look at frame time charts individually at the end of this review. The 4060 Ti leads the 4060 by 13%. Compared to previous generations, though, the 4060 is ahead of the 3060 by 19%, the RTX 2060 by 30%, and the GTX 1060 6GB by 97%. Intel's Arc cards aren't as competitive here as they were previously, but they're still hanging in there. The A750's 170 FPS average achieves 89% of the performance for 83% of the price when at $250. Or for 73% of the price if it's on sale for $230, which just was recently. 1440p allows us to add some other cards back to the chart, as load ramps enough to decrease the CPU bind. The 4060 falls just behind the A770 here, and its 119 FPS average has it between that and the A750. Lows are similar between these three cards, and the RX 7600 is beaten by 8%. So NVIDIA has climbed here relative to our first game we were testing. Generationally, the 4060 still holds a 22% lead over the 3060, similar to the 1080p spacing, although the 3060 Ti outmatches the 4060. At 4K, the RTX 4060 held 53 FPS average and sat again between the Intel Arc cards. Its lead over the competing RX 7600 has expanded to 15%, finally establishing a meaningful gap between the two of them. Generationally, the 4060 holds a 19% lead against the 3060, so it's at least not struggling as much as the 4060 Ti was against the 3060 Ti, where we often saw equivalence, or in the worst cases, the 3060 Ti outperforming the 4060 Ti. As for the Ti, its lead is about 20% over the 4060, with the 3060 Ti in the position we showed in our 4060 Ti review. An embarrassing lead. Now for F1 at 1080p. The RTX 4060's 145 FPS average has it functionally tied with the RX 7600 in averages. However, the 4060 maintains far better 1% and 0.1% lows in this particular game. It'd be the actual victor here, given just those two. The RX 6700 XT is actually a compelling alternative. As long as those $310 to $330 options last, it holds a 33% lead over the 4060 for likely the same price as most other partner models. That one would make the most sense at the price in this scenario. The Intel Arc cards struggle with this particular game, and they have since launch. They're both towards the bottom of the chart at 1080p, illustrating why we still can't give the A750 a sweeping recommendation. It's still more of an enthusiast's card. At 1440p, the RTX 4060 held 106 FPS average, reducing its lead over the 3060 to 16%. The Ti's 26% lead pushes it to 133 FPS average, but the 6700 XT maintains a lead even ahead of that, and it's still available in this price class. As for AMD's RX 7600, it's again technically tied to the 4060, but it's behind in lows, and Arc remains behind as well. Finally, at 4K, the 4060's lead over the 3060 shrinks to 12%. It's still ahead at least, but the behavior between the 3060 Ti and 4060 Ti has carried down the stack. They're just far enough apart this time where it's not as bad. The A770 technically pulls ahead, but given its struggles comparatively in this title, we wouldn't recommend it over the 4060. Total Warhammer is another highly intensive game in our suite. At 1080p, the RTX 4060 landed at 105 FPS average, ahead of the A770 in average FPS, but also more significantly ahead in lows. The 3060 Ti outdoes the 4060 here, as does the 6700 XT, although neither by as impressive a margin as we've seen previously. Critically, the 7600 is within range of the average FPS of the 4060 again, but remains behind in lows, and we'll look at Frametime charts at the end, because they're kind of interesting. At 1440p, the 4060 remains sandwiched between the Arc cards, still with advantaged lows though, while the 7600 trails in all metrics here. The uplift over the 3060 is 16%, so still a better generational gain than basically 0% that we saw in the 4060 Ti and 3060 Ti. But this game is challenging to run at 4K, so let's move on to the next game. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is next. In this one, the RTX 4060 ran at 158 FPS average, separated from the 4060 Ti by a 30 FPS gap, or 18%. The 6700 XT is ahead of the 4060 by 14%, keeping it on the short list of desirable cards for value right now. Against the new 7600, the 4060 holds a 5% lead, which isn't a big enough gap to really care about, especially if there's a price difference, and the lows are close enough to be basically noise between the results. Intel's Arc A750 is unfortunately challenged in this one. It's facing the same immature driver issue that Intel has had in some of the other games. The A750's 109 FPS average allows a massive 50 FPS gap, or about 45% between it and the 4060. Although Intel has clearly become fiercely competitive in some titles, it still has less predictable behavior overall. In Tomb Raider at 1440p, the 4060 ran at 103 FPS average and was about tied with the 7600. Given the new $250 pricing of the 7600, sometimes anyway, it depends on which one you look at, that's really just not good positioning overall for the 4060. NVIDIA doesn't even have a lows advantage in this particular title. For the Ti cards, the 4060 Ti has a 22% lead, so that appears to be about the average between these games. The 3060 Ti is dangerously close to the 4060 here, and encroaching on the 4060 Ti, but we already know that story. The 6700 XT deserves yet another mention. Although certainly not long for this world, it's carrying a 22% lead over the 4060 at about the same price at the time of writing. We don't know how long that stock will last, but they must have enough for now. Out of curiosity, we'll quickly look at 4K as well. This is mostly important to understand if the 4060 and 3060 behave as the 3060 Ti and 4060 Ti did. That answer is no, but the behavior still matches. The 4060 was 21% of the 3060 in the 1440p test. It was at 28% ahead in the 1080p test. But it's only 13% ahead in the 4K test, so that is diminishing significantly with each resolution increase. Fortunately, it's not diminishing at a pace where it becomes realistically relevant or limiting, which is contrary to what we saw in the 4060 Ti versus 3060 Ti comparison. And that's on display right here once again, but it still shows the architectural shift favoring 1080p. As someone who's been reviewing cards long enough now to remember 1080p with high settings being a big deal on $200 cards, it hasn't gotten any less weird that we're still there today. The software landscape has changed, games have changed, but it seems like we're still targeting 1080p. Horizon Zero Dawn was one of the worst case scenarios for the 4060 Ti versus 3060 Ti comparison, so it's back. This game was particularly challenging for the 4060 Ti because of the bus width and frame buffer limitations. The 4060 ran at 143 FPS average at 1080p, which has it about tied with the RX 7600. AMD also benefits here because its lows are technically higher. The Intel cards remain toward the bottom of this chart, so they're out of the consideration for this one. And generationally, NVIDIA posts about a 15% gain over the 3060 here, 41% over the 2060, and about 133% over the 1060. At 1440p, the 4060 Ti led the 4060 by 16%, with the 3060 Ti about the same in rank. The 7600 is functionally tied with the 4060 again in all metrics, and the 6700 XT retains an 18% lead over the 4060. Compared to the 3060, the 4060's lead is only 12% this time. That's slimmed down from some of the other tests. Just to study architecture again, at 4K, the 4060 leads the 3060 by only 11% here, so the gap is dropping. The 4060 also is at risk of struggling with textures as playtime extends in some of these titles that are VRAM heavy. Even the A750 is about caught up with the 4060 now. Power consumption is up now. NVIDIA originally leaned on power consumption as its main marketing point for the RTX 4060, specifically mentioning how much money can be saved over a 4-year period, which is a long enough time scale that we know NVIDIA definitely doesn't want you to own that card that long anyway. But it's a reach for something positive, is the point. We always test power anyways, we're going to look at that. And the RTX 4060 pulls about 120 watts under a full load. So in the sense of power consumption, they're right. It is generally efficient, particularly against the previous generation. The ASUS dual card offers an additional 20% power offset, and that should increase it to about 144 watts by math, but given the FFXIV power virus behavior, it ends up at 164 watts with an OC. The 120 watt number is the most relevant though, that's stock. That's less than the RTX 3050 previously, and it's about 40 watts under the RX 7600. So again, it's true that NVIDIA is more efficient, but the multi-year savings argument is just really weak. First of all, you of course have to look at the delta between the power consumed, and you have to assume a pretty high amount of hours of full power consumption per day. It would be erroneous to look at only the absolute power. It's that difference that matters. But this becomes more relevant in areas where power is more expensive too. So the argument, even just in general, might not stand well where you live. For a lot of you in Europe, we know it's very expensive for power. For us, it's 10 cents per kilowatt hour. So it just depends on where you live. Secondly, the low-end market isn't really the place to make that argument. It matters more at the high end, and NVIDIA is a shameless consumer of a lot of power there. The power figure and efficiency are both good on the 4060. It's just not what we think people should use to determine whether they're buying a card for gaming, unless they're running it nearly constantly. With power out of the way, let's briefly look at ray tracing. In Cyberpunk, we test ray tracing while also enabling like-for-like SR technologies. For AMD, that's FSR. For NVIDIA, it's DLSS2. These are configured for equal horizontal and vertical scaling. The RTX 4060 ran at 81 FPS average at 1080p with RT on and using DLSS. That has it at 18% ahead of the 3060. So the scaling is similar to what we saw in rasterized scenarios. The 4060 now leads the RX 6700 XT, establishing an advantage in RT in this title, and it has a significant lead over the Intel cards on FSR. The RX 7600 is also left far behind, down at 57 FPS average, allowing a 42% lead for the 4060. It just doesn't have the horsepower to push both RT, higher graphics settings, and then still maintain the frame rate with both of those. We won't bother showing 1440p, it cut the performance more than in half, so it's just not playable. Tomb Raider's next. The 4060's 94 FPS average has it ahead of the 7600 by 21%. That's half the lead that it had in the more RT-heavy Cyberpunk title, but still enough of a lead to demonstrate that the 4060's primary advantage over the 7600, other than efficiency, is ray tracing performance. The 6700 XT is basically tied with the 4060 here, dragging its lead down from previously. Now in F1 with ray tracing, the 4060 ran at 63 FPS average and was about tied with the 6700 XT. If you've been listening to our 6700 XT recommendations during the first half of the review, evaluate your RT usage when making your final decision, because this is the area the card is the strongest. More RT might swing you back towards NVIDIA, one way or the other. Now we're moving to Frametime charts. This is a blank template for the next chart. Frametimes represent the frame-to-frame latency measured in on present on the left axis. That time is in milliseconds, so it's how long each frame takes to present to the screen and render. Lower is better, but more consistent is best, and spikes greater than 8 to 12 milliseconds, especially if they are repeated and frequent, become noticeable. An ideal consistency, technically, would be a nearly flat line, but that's kind of just VSync, except without cutting off the frame ceiling. Realistically, it doesn't work that way though, because you need room to scale up and down as the workload increases or decreases. Here's the first plot. Total War has the RTX 4060 maintaining frame times around 8 milliseconds, and it slows to 10 milliseconds as we get into a more difficult part of the benchmark, and then continues to scale. Overall, its behavior is consistent. The largest excursions are to 22 milliseconds and 20 milliseconds, but 2 frames out of the first 1800 or so really isn't that bad. There's a couple more in there, but this is overall pretty good behavior. The RX 7600 is next. This one has far more excursions. It's not bad overall. None of these are catastrophic, but it explains why we saw the lower frame time consistency in our earlier average bar chart. Those 1% and 0.1% bars help point us toward the need for specific frame time plots. The 7600 blows out the 0.1% average with the spikes that we're seeing to 40 milliseconds and 35 milliseconds. It's just generally less consistent, and there are enough of these to be occasionally visible as stutters. The 4060 is more consistent here. The next chart is for Horizon Zero Dawn at 1080p. In this one, the RTX 4060 plotted between 6 to 8 milliseconds, typically about 7 milliseconds, with overall consistent frame-to-frame intervals. The RX 7600 had more visibly noticeable spikes on a line graph, but despite this, the 7600 was overall lower in its average frame times, and in that sense, it was more consistent too. The end of the chart most clearly illustrates the 4060's slightly wider top to bottom range. Finally, here's a frame time chart for Cyberpunk 2077. In this one, the RTX 4060 was consistent overall. The game is more variable in load, so we see this up and down pattern. That's not indicative of bad frame time pacing here though, because each frame, sort of n-1 frames or n+1 frames, are relatively consistent. It's just that the RX 7600 was better. So as you saw in the average chart, the two were close. It's just AMD held the lead for this test, and that's reflected here. So the review is pretty simple. This isn't as egregiously embarrassing and bad as the 4060 Ti was, because the 4060 Ti was surpassed, as a reminder, by the 3060 Ti in like 4K gaming. That's bad. It's really terrible to be beaten by the prior generation product that you are supposed to be replacing. It's difficult as a reviewer as you get deeper and deeper into sort of a generation or review cycle to look at the pricing, because you kind of have to avoid being gaslit by the companies into this is a new normal. Let's look at this objectively. First of all, the 7600 and the 4060 Ti have both dropped in price lately. Not every 4060 Ti has dropped, but it's starting. Those dominoes will continue to fall. The companies overbought, expecting the crypto and pandemic boom to last for eternity, and that expectation has led them to overstuffing the market with supply that is actually still clearing even for the 30 series and the 6000 series. Of course, the longer people delay purchasing, the lower those prices will fall. Remember, if you bought a card in 2020 or later, you can probably skip this entire generation. The 30 series was pretty good. The 6000 series also pretty good, at least for hard numbers. So if you bought one of those, it's good to stay informed, but it's pretty normal in any time of this market, any year, to skip at least one generation. Plus, it just reduces waste if you're happy with what you have. Now, if you just want a fun project for a weekend, go for it, but waiting will probably continue to yield drops. Now that said, if you're buying this card, here's what we think about each alternative. In rasterization, the RX 6700 XT is still competitive. It's not always as consistent in frame times, but it's often ahead in FPS enough that it doesn't really matter. It's just a better alternative. That lead, however, diminishes as we enter ray tracing scenarios, but if you're able to get one close to $300, and especially if you mostly play rasterized games, it is strongly worth considering as a top choice. If we were willing to recommend it as an alternative to the 4060 Ti at a similar price, then of course it follows it would make sense as an alternative to the 4060. And the pricing, at least at the time we wrote this script, I just checked and I saw 3 cards on Newegg that were in stock for $310 after a promo code you have to apply and checkout. And then there were some others in the $330 range, so that's pretty good. Next one, in rasterization, the RX 7600 is often close to the 4060. Not always, but now that there are $50 price drops sometimes on some of these models, which is a 17% reduction, it is close enough to be meaningful at this budget. In ray tracing, the 7600 falls behind significantly in some of our tests, and that's where the 4060 starts to make more sense. That's where you need to think about it more. Efficiency on the 4060 is actually really good, to give NVIDIA credit, although their argument of saving money over a 4-year period involves so many assumptions and so many hoops that you have to jump through, and also ignores many of the other variables, that it becomes basically a pointless argument, at least for the money we're talking about. So that's our review. It kind of still looks like the stack is shifting a little bit. If you're looking for advice, my personal advice here would be to wait unless you really need something. I mean, if you need a card because you have a half-complete system, yours died, or you need something better for what you do, fine. Ignore this advice. If you don't need one right now, and you do have the luxury of waiting a little bit, I'd wait. And my reasoning is pretty simple. We have all 3 GPU suppliers signaling to us loud and clear that they need to drop the prices right now. That includes Intel. And perhaps some of these reductions are temporary, sales do happen, but when I personally see all competitors in a sphere reducing prices and their partners reducing prices, it starts to look like the market hasn't settled and there may yet be new pricing coming in. So I'd wait, but yeah, that's just what I would do. There's your numbers though. The best thing I could say about it is that it's not as embarrassing as the 4060 Ti. That was pretty bad. That's it for this one though. Thanks for watching. As always, subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to support us directly, and we'll see you all next time.